I'm here with David Osit, who is the producer, director, cinematographer, editor, and one of the composers for the movie you have just watched, Mayor. He's also directed another really wonderful documentary called Thank You for Playing, which, if you're in Canberra, you can watch on our amazing public library streaming service, Canopy. If you're not connected to that, catch me after the screening and I will tell you how to get set up with them. But David, thank you so much for making time to talk to us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, I'm sure this movie is relatable to a lot of people because you've worked really hard to create this sort of archetypal, fable-like quality. But I think it's probably particularly relatable to Canberran audiences because this is the capital city, it's a public service town, there's a lot of people working in government and local governance. I'm wondering where the first spark of that idea came from to use local governance as a lens to explore this part of the world.
Well, it's a great question. Thank you. I mean, I think that local government is many things. Chief among them, relatable and hilarious. And I think that the confluence of those two attributes. First of all, neither of them really show up in depictions of the global South, for example, or showing up in depictions of Palestine or in the Middle East. And my goal with this film was really about trying to add imagery to the idea of what Palestine could look like for basically for people who had never been. And I didn't doubt that certain Palestinian audiences would see the film, or people who knew the area would see the film. And I was always hoping that they would enjoy the film. But my audience was always people in the West who, are living inside of governmental bodies that have no interest in sharing any truth of the circumstances that orbit Palestine, or any depth of the realities that Palestinian lives are experiencing on a daily basis. So for me, I saw local government. It was more cart before the horse because I heard about the municipality, and I was spending some time in Ramallah. I was doing some editing work for another filmmaker, a Palestinian filmmaker, and it had been several years since I'd been to the city, and I think maybe before 4 or 5, and I was amazed how much the city had changed in the time since I'd been there. And it seemed like all of a sudden there were these hipster bars and nightclubs and free unlimited public Wi-Fi and a Jaguar dealership. And I would ask people and they'd say, well, the mayor's changed a lot of this. And I kept thinking, well, I'm really curious what his job is like and what it's like to, basically this question was like, how do you run a city when you don't have a country? What goes into the leadership of a city in that context? But also thinking about local government as this thing that was both rife with absurdity and dignity, and the balance between those two. Because people in local government, as I'm sure again your audiences can relate to, as you said, people in government, whether it's local or not, really are working so incredibly hard for something that to the outside eye seems so simple. Something as simple as paving a street, putting on a festival. The amount of work that goes into this is quite staggering. But I felt that that almost mirrored the feeling of the occupation. There's this simultaneous element of absurdity to it. That it's innately absurd and unjust, but there's also a tremendous amount of dignity and passion that goes into the antagonism against the military occupation of Palestine. And I wanted to capture both of those things. So local government felt like an incredible way to do that focus.
Thank you so much. Yeah, what I'm really interested by is the fact that both of those things you talk about, the sense of dignity in the film and the humor in the film, are both acts of resistance for people that are living in Ramallah. When you get to this beautiful fountain at the end, seeing how much beautiful public life is a real act of resistance, but also humor can be not just a coping mechanism, but an act of resistance. And I'm interested in how you thought about making this such a funny movie.
Yeah, well, like we were talking about, I think that humor is a remarkable point of relationship between an audience and the people who are inside of a movie. I mean, they're characters, but I don't think of them as characters when I'm making the film, or when I'm inside of the world with these people. I became very close to Musa and his family and his colleagues and everything. But I'm also aware of the fact that I'm making a film, and so it's like if I was working with if I were working with actors, as a director of a fiction film, that I would be close to the actors and be considerate of what their needs were, but also be able to zoom out and see what role they're playing. And in this film, it's a documentary, but I like to think of it a little bit more as like nonfiction filmmaking, and that I'm using non-actors to tell a story. And what that story was in the context of your question was, well, uh, if there's humor in the story, if something's funny, it was really important to me to make sure. Well, you're not laughing at anybody in this film. You're laughing because of what kind of the root of satire is, which is I think defined by many people in many different ways. But I like one definition, which is dignified people in undignified situations, and that's really fundamental to what the humor is in this film. When you first meet Mayor Musa in this movie, in the first, the shot you see of him is he's sitting in a cafe, drinking his cappuccino, and it kind of oozes dignity. I think you it was really important to me as a filmmaker that I give the audience no doubt in the first 5 minutes of this film that anything that makes you laugh in this movie is not going to be at the expense of the characters we're following. No, as we say in the States, no punching down. Like I needed this to feel like you were laughing because you were relating, and each laugh, not to sound terribly holistic about it, but each laugh kind of brings you closer to the subjects of the story, because each laugh brings you deeper into a sense of empathetic understanding of what they might be experiencing, because these things are relatable. I don't believe that the news that you're seeing today, here May 12th, regarding what's happening in Palestine, in Gaza, in Jerusalem right now. I don't think that news is relatable for much of your audience. I don't think it's relatable to much of the people that I would encounter walking down the street. Um, it's relatable to a very small percentage of the world's population, but everyone knows what a mayor does. Everyone knows how a city runs. And if I could give that point of moral relativism to a story, I figured it would let certain people in who otherwise feel excluded from understanding this part of the world.
In other interviews, I've heard you talk about him as this sort of old Hollywood sort of Gary Cooper figure. And you also reference like a huge wealth of cinematic history. I've heard you talk about Armando Iannucci, Jacques Tati, Elia Suleiman, Veep, Czech New Wave. And I'm wondering how important you think that universe of narrative references are for a documentary filmmaker.
I think that's such a wonderful question. For me, they're vital. I think there's lots of documentary filmmakers and documentary films that are less interested in their films being a reference to the tradition of storytelling. I think that there's almost a missing a missing word that we don't have in our like film discourse, which is something between documentary and fiction. And that's why I used the phrase earlier, nonfiction film, because I do think that there's a difference between I think there's a difference between a reality show like Keeping Up with the Kardashians and like a majority of the films that were nominated for the Oscar this year, or from Mayer, or from other films that are basically they're nonfiction movies, and you watch them and some people are like, oh well, I can't quite tell if it's scripted or not. It's not. I'm not trying to be clever. I'm just trying to make a film, and for me, that served a double purpose in Mayer. One was that I really like those kinds of movies, and I actually prefer fiction films over nonfiction films. I just like fiction a lot more. As maybe evidenced by these posters behind me. But I also felt that there was a problem of representation to contend with when it came to this film. I mean, I could spend forever answering this question, so I'll try to be brief because it's a wonderful question. But for me, it was fundamental to what drew me to it. I had seen so many films about this part of the world that frustrated me in their one dimensionality and their lack of nuance, whether they're documentaries or not. And oftentimes, I would actually find that the fictional films even. Would maybe they'd be great, maybe they'd be really compelling, but they would always be kind of prizing an Israeli narrative or Israeli complexity, and the Israeli characters who are struggling with their sense of guilt about the occupation or their sense of shame, and that's great. But even in those stories, Palestinian characters are rendered to one dimension. They're basically there to just further the emotional advancement and evolution of a Western character, and that's the way that's the way this canon has started to develop, as far as I've seen it as a Westerner. And I wanted to disrupt that and try to make a film that was adding a completely different landscape. And so I was trying to use these tropes of cinematic representation uh, and using this feeling of kind of ensconcing the film in this sort of glowing golden age of Hollywood feeling at the beginning. It was really intentional. It wasn't just because I thought, oh, wouldn't that be clever? It felt suited to the story and suited to Musa, who like you had just mentioned, like I do see him as just sort of Gary Cooper, Spencer Tracy leading man in some ways in terms of the way he carries himself. And that I saw that in him and knew that the film had to basically match him. I think that if this was about a different kind of person, a different kind of story, it wouldn't have been appropriate. But using tropes of Hollywood movies felt in keeping with what this movie was trying to accomplish.
One of the most surprising elements in this movie that I think brings that multidimensionality is your use of music. Um, you have gathered music from all over the world. You talked about not wanting to hear oud in the soundtrack, but instead there's folk music from Georgia and Korea, and there's Japanese composers, and you also actually composed some of the music. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process of gathering the music and choosing the music, and also maybe your own practice as a composer.
Yeah, I felt that the music was just as fundamental to the storytelling in Mayer as any edit decision I was making. It felt like I could use music as a tool to help give you an understanding in the first 5, 6 minutes of this film what kind of movie you're going to be watching. I can always, I watch a lot of films for work. I do editing work. I'll compose for people. I'll work with other filmmakers. I'll teach classes. I watch a lot as part of just my job. And I can always, every movie, this is a little bit more like film school 101 sort of thing. So forgive me if anyone listening to this is totally bored by this, but I think that every film kind of teaches you how to watch it in the first few minutes. It's not conscious, it's very subconscious, but in the first 5, 6 minutes of the film you can tell whether it's going to be funny, whether it's going to be trying to be funny, whether what kind of genre it is, what the approach is going to be. And a film teaches you that really early on. And what I wanted this film to do is in the first 6 minutes make you wonder, well, okay, this is not going to be the normal Palestine Israel movie. I really wanted to get you away from that. And I did love your introduction, Hannah, because this notion of a fable was really fundamental to me in thinking, well, how can I make the smallest story possible? And I think that was very much a rebuttal to this instinct that a lot of nonfiction filmmakers have, that they have to put the entire world on screen and put the entire mass of complexity on screen. I call it foie gras filmmaking. It's just how many ideas can we stuff down the audience's throat at once? And I didn't want to do that. I actually felt like I could give an audience more of an emotional evolution and an emotional education by making the simplest story, and then the non-fable like elements when the occupation basically asserts itself into the filmmaking. Those are the moments that I think actually end up shaking you more, because I think, to go back to my original point of how a film teaches you to watch it, every film also kind of has an EKG, where, like a heart rate monitor, where it's some films are very sharp hills and valleys, like let's call those the Marvel movies, and then there are films that are slower and more patient, where the smallest thing can feel disruptive, and the smallest thing can feel like an earthquake in the landscape of the movie. And I wanted to make a film where those little things would matter, where Musa's facial expression would change your understanding of how he's feeling, and where something like the music would actually make you understand what you're watching. So you're hearing orchestral music, you're hearing vocal music that's been recorded from all these different traditions. This is all by a band named Jino Yamashirogumi, which is a 70s prog band that's now mostly defunct, but they're most famous for the soundtrack of the Japanese anime film Akira. And I loved the idea of hearing music from all these different countries, and you can't necessarily place them. What it does is it places you somewhere else. It continues to move you around. It's like being blindfolded and led around a room. You don't know exactly where you are. You just know you're being moved somewhere. And I wanted that. I wanted the music to feel that way. And then there's a little bit of choral music that I worked on, a little bit of string music. There's some diegetics music that just that appears in the frame. Obviously, Mayer Hadid composes a little bit in the film, as you can see. So it was a big team operation.
That's one of my favorite moments in the movie, is where you see him at his keyboard playing at the end of a long day. It's a very humanizing moment. Thinking about creating this cinematic representation of Palestine that we haven't seen on screen before. Obviously, taking a step back in the process, before composing, you also shot the film yourself. You're a one-person crew. And if you're thinking about the mayor's facial expressions, or about creating these new visions of this place, how are you thinking about where to point the camera, where to stand, when to hit record, when to stop recording? How are you making those decisions in the moment as a camera person?
A lot of those decisions are lessons learned along the path of working for a decade in film, and not being my first rodeo, which was really helpful. It would have been really hard if this were the first time I'd sat down and tried to make all these rules for myself. But that's basically what it was. It was me sitting down at the beginning of this whole process before I shot a frame and thinking, well, I'm going to make rules as to how I want this film to look, and I'm going to follow them until they no longer serve me, and then I'll break them if necessary. I think that's what good filmmaking tends to be, is that kind of flexibility meets that kind of rigidity. And at the beginning, I I thought to myself, I'm going to film only wide, no close-ups. I was upset with my last film, Thank You for Playing. I felt like I did too many like extreme close-ups, and I started to feel that the emotion, the more I did that, would ooze out of a shot, because it was giving too much into a single shot, and I wanted to do less of that. I wanted to make the audience feel like they were observing. I wanted to make the film feel less like a typical There But for the Grace of God filmmaker just lands here for 2 weeks and films stuff. And I hated that feeling. I wanted the film to not feel like some Western person helicoptered in and captured stuff, because I mean, that was the elephant in the room at times. I mean, I'm not Palestinian. I'm American. I knew the language. I got better at it. I'd spent years studying in Cairo, but that was a different dialect. And then uh, I got to Ramallah, and my language ability was very rusty, which actually helped me in terms of my shooting style, because I had to be paying attention to people's body language, and I had to, if I only understood 4 or 5 words of what was being said, I had to basically try to tell where the conversation was going based on how people were acting, performing physically. And that was an incredible boon, actually, to the filmmaking at the beginning. Is it made me have to be very, very attentive to what people were saying physically rather than verbally. And I think it also, it wouldn't be, like I was saying, it wouldn't be a great angle for any film. But thankfully Mayor Musa was such a physically expressive person, and he would say so much with his expressions. And a very wise editor once told me that a smile can be a scene, and I never forgot that expression of excitement that came with this feeling. Yeah, sometimes, well, some of the most powerful moments in a storytelling can not have any words in them at all. And again, it's this deep conditioning, especially in modern Western documentary tradition, that that if it's not said, it doesn't exist, and I wanted to respect my audience a little bit more than that.
That definitely comes through. How early in that process, if you're shooting the footage yourself, how early in the process do you start editing? And how different does that feel to when you're working as an editor on someone else's project?
Mm. Oh, wow. Well, the latter I'll get to in a second. But in this case, since I was a one person band, I basically had to come back and edit sample reels every time I'd shoot. I would go for about 3 week shoots. I couldn't do more than that. I'd get too exhausted. It was too hard to just be alone for those 3 weeks and be doing everything. I would start to notice that I would be slipping. I would just get lazy at the end, and I would just want to eat falafel and not go to work. And I knew I had to get myself home. So I would spend 3 weeks, and then I'd spends another like a month basically back in the States, where I live, fundraising and writing grant proposals and taking meetings. And then I'd go back and do it again. And it was a full-time job basically, just to raise money for the film. Uh, I felt like it was a rather tall order at first. And I would basically pitch the film as, as Veep, but in Palestine, or as Parks and Recreation in Palestine. And a lot of people did not understand that that was a thing that would be fundable until I started to cut these reels, and I knew I had to prove it. And then I was able to start raising some money once people started seeing what this film was. But I still didn't really understand the film fully, um, until much deeper in the edit process. And I didn't really, in earnest, start editing what I thought would be the film. I would edit sample reels. I'd cut scenes. But the scenes were always just moments. I never really started to be able to edit the film until I filmed The Fountain, because then I knew I had my ending, and I really like being able to work towards something, whether it's a middle or a beginning. I can work backwards to a beginning in the edit room, or I can work forwards to the ending. But I need to work to something, and that was the first moment. I kind of learned my ending, and then discovered the rest of the film in a funny way.
And how much does that, when you know what the ending is, or when you start to see the film emerge, how much does that direct what you're then looking at with your camera? Does the editing sort of inform the shooting? I think people often think about documentary as sort of, you get this bulk of footage. I know you shot like 350 hours for this film. People think you have this bulk of footage and then you chip away at it to find the story. But here it sounds like more as you were editing that started to inform what you were looking at.
From the beginning of, as I'm filming too, I'm thinking, well, what interests me? Why am I here? What am I focusing on? And so I'm going in with some intentionality. It's not always correct, and there's certain moments when in 350 hours of footage, I can't get everything. Um, there's a lot of boring stuff, right, in that, but patience was really important here. But I would notice and know how, basically, Frederick Wiseman, who's a wonderful American filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, who's been working for 50 years, 60 years now almost. He would always talk about, when he's filming, he's like, oh, well, if I'm bored, I'll stop. Like if I'm behind the camera and if I'm filming something, and if it's boring, then I'll stop doing it. And I that felt almost, like, oh my goodness, how could you say such a thing, when I first heard it? But I've since realized everything I've done when with this kind of film, of a verite film, a observational film. I don't like the word observational because it kind of feels a little colonial to me. But the basic idea is that I'm following real people and filming real people. With a film like that, uh, it has to stay interesting to me, because if it's not interesting to me, I won't be able to convey that interest to you. And a lot of this film was basically my journey to get to the core of this question, which was, how do you run a city if you don't have a country? And the exploration of that question was why I wanted to make the film, because I didn't have an answer, and I don't think there's a single answer. But the film endeavored to try to answer that question, and the reason I basically was able to help. The reason I could help inform the edit and the shooting and everything once I had the ending is because I learned the answer when I filmed the fountain. And the answer was, that this fountain had become, in the course of the film, a symbol of resistance and an act of resistance, where in the first 10 minutes when you're watching these Christmas celebrations, you're thinking to yourself, probably that's a very strange way maybe for a city to spend its time, or for a mayor to spend their time. But by the end, you understand the importance of something like this, and that it's more than just a gesture. It's a way in which to have control, in a context where control has been removed, and destroyed by a foreign military power occupying your land. And seeing that fountain and seeing these three generations of young boys and men standing outside the fountain, and which are the last three shots of the film, which is, it's these little kids throwing rocks into the fountain, and then the guys and then Nutella shirts, one generation older, which kind of is representing a little bit of that sort of capitalism infusion into Ramallah, as an opiate in some ways, for sure. And then the third generation is Musa again, this man we've been following, and it's these three generations of boys, Palestinian boys, basically just here with this fountain. And I realized that the answer to this question was, yeah, you how do you run a city if you don't have a country? Again, as if you have one, as if you do have a country. And I once I learned that answer for myself, I knew what the film had to build up to. I knew where the stakes had to go. I knew that moment, for example, where Musa breaks the fourth wall and asks me a question, I knew that was the sort of turn in the film all of a sudden, and then it had to be in this place where it's at the deepest moment of when Musa starts to realize that there's a broken thing in the house, and it can't be ignored, and no one else can ignore it, and the film can't ignore it anymore either. And I felt like those moments all started to fall into place, but it was because I basically kept this question at the core of my emotional and ideological journey of making this film.
I definitely, as a viewer, went on that journey that you're talking about, starting by watching these activities, finding this sort of public life a little bit cheesy, or something that I wouldn't be interested in, and by the end watching this fountain, just being totally astounded by how beautiful and important it is. Well, the question everyone in the audience always wants to know, I think, is, has Musa seen the film? What did he think of it? What was your experience of showing it to him like?
I showed him the film, him and his family. I showed the film. We were all sitting on that couch that you see in the movie in his living room. I showed it to him about a month before the film premiered. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. He loved it. His family loved it. I was very glad. I've said this before, but I would have been kind of basically confused if he didn't love the film, because I worked very, very hard to show this image of Ramallah through his eyes. And I felt really in tune with him, and I felt like we were collaborators. Like, we would talk a lot about the movie and what I was doing, and he, there was no sort of I'm going to disappear and I'll show you the movie someday sort of thing. We would talk, and it was important to me, and that he liked the movie, that it felt honest and true to him. So I'm glad he liked it, and that his family liked it, and we still talk, and he's fine. At the moment, as of today, the circumstances in Ramallah are tense, but the circumstances in Ramallah are not the same as what they are like inside of the Green Line and in Gaza at the moment. But everyone's cautious and hopeful.
I think the ultimate power of this movie is that it does really center this Palestinian voice and this Palestinian character. You talk in a few other interviews about movies that sort of accidentally relegate the Palestinian characters to window dressing or these one-dimensional characters who are either victims or terrorists. And I think your film really successfully grants that complexity and that surprise to this character. I wonder, maybe as a final question, if you have any recommendations for our viewers about movies by Palestinian filmmakers that you think might continue broadening that journey to complexifying this sort of cinematic world.
A wonderful question. Thank you. And I appreciate what you said. One film actually that you brought up earlier that I think is just truly divine, no pun intended, is this film called Divine Intervention by Elia Suleiman, who's a Palestinian filmmaker. I think it's a very special film. It's in the vein of a absurdist comedy, Jacques Tati feeling vibe to it, but also reminds me a little bit of Roy Andersson films. That it's exceptional. I'd never seen anything like it. It was really quite staggering for me, and that's a film that I love to recommend, as well as I haven't seen his recent film, but he just made a film that won a prize at Cannes 2 or 3 years ago as well. And there's Raya Dandoni's film called Ghost Hunting, which I thought is a rather fascinating piece of cinema too. It's trading very much in the psychology of occupation, but it's on a really deep level engaging with what it is to be a Palestinian person in this context. And those stories are not rare. They're just not seen as much by Westerners.
Thank you so much. Well, maybe we'll have a look at where our viewers can access those movies as well, so they can follow them up. And again, if you enjoyed Mare, you can see David's other film, Thank You for Playing, on Canopy through the ACT Public Library service. David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.